The feed store smelled of grain dust and leather, and it was in that smell that Adelaide Cross would forever remember the moment her life became a transaction. She stood a half step behind her father, close enough to touch him, far enough that no one in the room mistook her for someone whose opinion mattered. Elias Cross had brought his daughter along the way. A man brings a document he needs signed, present, necessary, silent. Tobias Wren sat behind the counter with a ledger open before him, running his finger down a column of numbers that represented 2 years of bad harvests, a dead mule, and debts that had multiplied like weeds in a field nobody had the strength to plow. $400. Adelaide had heard the figure whispered in her house for weeks, always in the tone people used for a diagnosis they didn't want to name aloud. She hadn't understood, until this morning, that the cure for her father's debt would be her. By the door stood Judah Cole, and it was his stillness that unsettled her most. He did not lean against the frame the way other men did when they were bored or waiting. He stood the way a fence post stands, planted, indifferent to weather, built for a purpose that had nothing to do with comfort. His hat brim shadowed his eyes. He did not look at Adelaide once, not when Wren said her name, not when the terms were spoken aloud like the sale of a heifer, not when her father's hand hesitated over the pen for half a breath before signing anyway. Nobody addressed her directly. Wren spoke to her father spoke to Wren. The county clerk, when he arrived 20 minutes later with his traveling case of forms, addressed the room in general, as though Adelaide were furniture that happened to be present for the reading of her own fate. She wore her mother's church dress, the collar starched too tight, because it was the only dress she owned that felt like it belonged to someone worth marrying rather than someone being unloaded. The clerk's pen scratched against paper with the same flat, businesslike sound Adelaide had heard him make when he'd notarized the sale of Wren's mule the previous week. She cataloged that detail with a strange, cold precision. The mule had gone for $450. She was worth $50 less than livestock, and no one in the room seemed to find that arithmetic strange enough to pause over. She watched her father's signature dry on the page and felt something inside her chest go very quiet, the way a house goes quiet after a door slams somewhere far off. This was happening. This had already happened. The paper existed now. It would exist tomorrow and the day after, regardless of what she felt about it standing here in the dust and grain smell with a man who had not once met her eyes. Adelaide did not cry. She had decided that in the half-second before the pen touched paper, and she held to it the way she would hold to very little else that was entirely her own in the days to come. The wagon wheels found every rut in the road out of Prairie Hollow, and for 6 hours Adelaide Cross let the jolting silence between them feel like proof of something. She sat with her spine straight and her hands folded over the single traveling case that held everything she owned worth carrying, and she built her hatred the way her mother had once taught her to build a fire carefully, with kindling first. He bought me. He is no different from a man buying a plow horse. She repeated it until the words wore smooth, a psalm meant to protect her from whatever came next by making sure she expected nothing at all. But the road was long, and long roads have a way of contradicting the stories people tell themselves. That first night, when the temperature dropped hard after sundown, Judah unrolled their single blanket and set it across her shoulders without a word, then lay down himself on the bare ground with only his coat between him and the cold. Adelaide watched him do it and told herself it meant nothing, a man protecting his investment, nothing more. The second evening, he shot a rabbit clean through the brush with a single shot she hadn't even heard him aim for, and dressed it over the fire with the same silence he brought to everything. When he divided the meat, he gave her the better portion and took the leaner cut for himself, and said nothing about it, no comment inviting her gratitude, no look checking whether she'd noticed. It unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she knew how to categorize. It was crossing the creek bed the second afternoon that truly cracked something in the story she'd been telling herself. Her boot heel caught on a submerged root and snapped clean off, and before she could even decide how to be embarrassed about it, Judah had already knelt in the cold water, turned her boot over in his weathered hands, and set to mending it with a length of leather cord, working with the same unhurried focus he probably brought to shoeing a horse. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He didn't wait for thanks. He simply fixed what was broken and moved on, as though kindness were another item on a long list of ranch chores, necessary, unremarkable, not requiring witness. By the third night's fire, the silence had become unbearable in a different way than before, not hostile now, but confusing, and confusion frightened Adelaide more than certainty ever had. "You don't have to pretend I'm anything to you," she finally said, watching the flames instead of him. "I know what I am. I read the paper same as you did." Judah fed a branch into the fire and let the sparks climb before he answered. "I know what the paper says," he said, voice low and rough from disuse. "Paper's wrong about a lot of things." She turned the words over long after he'd gone quiet again, unable to make them fit anywhere in the story she'd built to protect herself. She did not ask what he meant. She had learned in 17 hard years that hope was the most expensive thing a poor girl could spend, and she was not yet ready to spend it on a man who had bought her for $400 and still hadn't explained why he wouldn't say so out loud. The wedding itself took less time than the argument over the debt had, back in the feed store. A circuit preacher who happened to be passing through said 11 words over them in Judah's small homestead kitchen, with no flowers and no music, only Judah's silent ranch hand standing near the stove, and a spotted dog asleep in the doorway who did not so much as lift its head for the occasion. It was, Adelaide thought, the plainest ceremony a life could offer, and somehow that plainness felt more honest than lace and ribbon would have. That night she sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the small back room and braced herself the way a person braces for a blow they've already decided is coming. Whatever gentleness Judah had shown her on the road, the blanket, the rabbit, the mended boot, she'd convinced herself it was a kind of courtesy that ended precisely at this doorway, the last stretch of civility before she became, completely and finally, a thing he owned rather than a person he'd married. Judah stood in the doorway a long while without crossing it. When he finally spoke, it was not what she braced for. "What's your name?" he asked, quiet as a man asking permission to enter his own house. She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "You know my name, it's on the license." "The license says Cross, Adelaide, female, age 17, transferred in settlement of debt." He said it slowly, like the words cost him something to speak aloud. "That ain't a name, that's a receipt." Then he did something he hadn't done once since the feed store. He crouched down until he was level with her eyes. "I'm asking you proper. Nobody in that room asked you anything, and I figure somebody ought to, before I go calling myself your husband." "What's your name, the one your mother gave you, not the one Wren wrote down?" Adelaide could not remember the last time anyone had asked her that in earnest. Not since her mother died, when her own name had stopped being something spoken with love and become instead a line item in her father's ledger of mouths to feed. She wept then, not from fear, but from the strange, unbearable violence of finally being seen by someone who had every reason not to bother. "Adelaide," she whispered, "my mother called me Addie." "Addie," he repeated, careful, as though setting something fragile down where it wouldn't shatter. "I'm not going to touch you tonight, or any night you don't ask me to." His voice roughened further. "I know what it is to be bought and sold in something that calls itself love. My own father sold cattle and daughters in the same breath, back in Missouri, and I swore I'd never be a man who couldn't tell the difference between the two. I lost a wife and a boy to fever, and I've been so lonely in this house I forgot the sound of my own voice. But I won't fill that loneliness with somebody else's grief. You'll keep your own room till you say otherwise." He paused. "That's my question answered. Now I've got one for you. Do you want to stay?" Adelaide did not answer right away, and she noticed distantly that Judah did not press her to. He simply waited, still crouched at her eye level, letting the silence stretch as long as she needed it, and that alone told her something no amount of pretty words could have. For the first time since standing behind her father in the feed store, someone had handed her future back to her as a question rather than a verdict, and she found she did not know how to hold something so unfamiliar. Nobody in that room with the ledger had asked her anything. Nobody in her whole life, it seemed, had thought her opinion worth the breath it would take to request it. She let her mind travel back over the debt that had started all of this, the $400 scratched into her father's account, the mule that had sold for more than she had. She thought of the 2 days on the road that followed, of a man the whole town called cold and silent, who had given her the only blanket while he shivered, who had handed her the better cut of rabbit without comment, who had knelt in creek water to mend her boot as though her comfort were simply one more chore on a long list he performed without needing thanks. She thought of how easily loneliness could have curdled into cruelty in a man like that, isolated on a homestead with a bought bride and no one watching how he treated her, and how, instead, it had made him careful. That, she realized, was not nothing. That was, perhaps, everything. "I want to stay," she finally said, and her voice was steadier than she expected it to be. "But not as a receipt, not as the woman Wren traded for a debt. If I stay, it's because you asked and because I'm answering, not because a paper says I have to." "That's the only way I'd have you," Judah said, and something in his rough voice settled, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried a long way. What grew between them after that was not the sort of romance found in hymnals or told breathlessly around a quilting frame. It was slower than that, and stranger and truer for being so. Judah taught her to shoot straight and to read the brand marks burned into cattle hide. Addie, in her own time, taught him how to let a silent house hold something other than grief. 2 winters passed before she called him husband in anything but the name a license had given him, and in all that time, he never once asked her to hurry toward a feeling she had to arrive at honestly or not at all. Prairie Hollow kept calling him the lonely cowboy long after loneliness had stopped being true of him, because towns are slow to revise a story once they've settled on its ending. But Addie carried the real truth of it privately, like a coin kept warm in a pocket. She had not been rescued. She had been asked. And in a life that had never once consulted her about her own fate, that single question, "What's your name? Do you want to stay?" was worth more than the $400 her father had traded her for, more than every lazy assumption the town had built around a quiet man and a bought bride. She had gone from a line item in a ledger to a name someone had chosen carefully to say out loud, and had chosen just as carefully to answer.